So we probably should get started. I'm Bill Woods. Welcome to the Community Issues Forum, once again via Zoom. We hope sometime in the near future to get back to the cathedral. These, of course, are sponsored by Christ Church Cathedral downtown. But we've spent quite a bit of time over the years focusing on poverty in Cincinnati and the whole affordable housing issue. It seems like we've done a number of forums. When LISC came out with its study that showed 28,000 units short in Cincinnati, when Xavier did its follow-up study for the city of Cincinnati. So we've done a lot of forums that have focused on the numbers. Today, I think we're taking another approach. By the way, this is a two-part series. Elizabeth Brown of the Cathedral and AHA gets credit for helping putting this together in terms of a two-part series that focuses on the affordable housing crisis. In part one, we're kind of taking a personalized approach of how it really impacts so many people. And we've got Mary Burke Rivers of Over-the-Rhine Community Housing, who's a long-time worker on this issue of housing. Before even, she just was talking about the days before she got into affordable housing, but she's doing some of the great work that
You're muted, Bill.
You're muted, Bill. Yeah.
Yeah, Alice, we just lost Bill.
Am I back on? You hear me now? Good. Okay, great. So part one, we're taking a much more personalized view. Part two, in 2 weeks, will focus on the charter amendment itself and what that proposes to do for the affordable housing issue. But today we have Stacey Burge of the Interfaith Hospitality Network that so many of you through your congregations, interfaith congregations, have been involved in, including Christ Church Cathedral, and Mary Burke of Over-the-Rhine Community Housing. And they're going to kind of give us, instead of getting away with all our focus that have been on the numbers, which are ghastly in itself, we're going to take a more personalized look at some of the problems that exist in our midst and its impact on families and the people that are so badly in need of this affordable housing. So maybe we should start off with Stacey Burge of Interfaith Hospitality Network to talk about its impact on so many of their clients.
Well, actually, Mary and I got a chance to talk yesterday. And so I think what we're going to do is start with the housing reality with Mary, and then talk about what that looks like for families at the service level. So I'll actually kick it over to Mary first.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so Stacey and I did talk yesterday, and hopefully this will flow well. And if I start to take up too much time, I won't be offended at all if Bill or Stacey, if you need to cut me off. So I'm the executive director at Over-the-Rhine Community Housing, and I've been with the organization since 1993. And prior to that, I was a social worker with the Hamilton County Department of Human Services. And my last position there was housing specialist. So I was working with families who were trying to find housing at that time, so many years ago. And unfortunately, it's just gotten more and more difficult, as Stacey will share. So I thought I'd start with talking about why it's so difficult, why housing is out of reach for so many people. So I'm going to share my screen, and let me see if I can do that somewhat gracefully. Okay, so you should be looking at a map right now. So this is from the National Low Income Housing Coalition website. And they do a report every year called Out of Reach, where they take a look across the country at cities, and in this case, even zip codes, to say what the housing wage is in that area to afford a 2-bedroom unit. So nowhere in the state of Ohio, as you might guess, or in the country, can you afford a 2-bedroom on minimum wage. So in this, what this page on their Out of Reach report can do is you can plug in a zip code to see what the housing wage to afford a 2-bedroom is in that zip code. So I was playing around with it beforehand, and I put 45242 in there. That's where my mom lives, so just curious. So that's the Blue Ash Kenwood area. So the living wage in that area to afford a 2-bedroom is $23.27. Oops. I'll just, let's see, put another zip code in there. I don't know if anybody has any requests, but I'll put in 45229. That's where I live. Did I put 282? So where I live in North Avondale, I live in Paddock Hills, actually, it's $15.38 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom. St. Bernard, it's $15.38. Evanston, $15.38. Norwood, $16.35. Clifton, $18.65. So it's kind of a fun tool to take a look at what the housing wage in those areas are. So I'm going to share another, if y'all are comfortable with me moving off of this, but you can go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website to play around, and you can look across the state of Ohio and across the country if you'd like. So let's see if I can stop sharing this and then just share another screen real quick, hopefully. Because the point I want to make is that there are folks who are working, who can't afford to pay what it costs to secure a 2-bedroom apartment. And I apologize while I look for this other, okay. So let's just look at a couple of those worker salary levels and see what they can afford in the marketplace. Expand this a little bit. So this doesn't include people, some of our retired folks who worked 50, 60 years of their life, 70 years in some cases, and didn't have a retirement plan, but are on Social Security because the market can't reach them at all. Or people on disability, the market can't reach them. And I'll get to why the market can't reach folks. But here's some employees that we come in contact with every day, some workers that we would see on a regular basis. Certified nursing assistants, the folks maybe who work in nursing homes, who take care of our family members, on average make $12.85 an hour. So with that salary, they could afford $668 a month. And by afford, we mean 30% of their income applied to their housing costs, including utilities. So the market rate for a 1-bedroom in our area is between $643 and $1,049 a month. So maybe they could find a decent 1-bedroom apartment at that wage, just a 1-bedroom though. But once you include utilities, you know, that it makes it more challenging. A preschool teacher, if you look at his or her salary, what they could afford is $669, again, including utilities. So if you subtract utilities out, maybe $600 a month. They couldn't afford a 2-bedroom. A cashier at Kroger or any supermarket, that's the average salary. They could afford $588. The market can't reach them, at least not responsibly. And a bus driver, maybe they can afford a 1-bedroom in the marketplace, but in 2-bedroom, maybe or maybe not. So then the question is why? Why is a preschool teacher or a CNA or a cashier not able to access housing in the marketplace? So I want to talk a little bit about that. As a developer of affordable housing, what makes it so hard? So as we're developing affordable housing, we have to do, as a nonprofit, we have to do the same thing that the for-profit sector does. You have to own or control the property. So you have to have money to buy it. And then once you buy it, depending on the condition of it, I'm sure the better the condition, the more expensive it would be. But if it needs repairs, then you have to be able to have the financing in place to repair it and get the units online and functional. So that's one piece of the math challenge as we talk about it, is the development costs. Of course, if you're developing a vacant building, then you have to finance the acquisition and then all the rehab costs. And if you can do it in such a way where you can minimize debt, then your operating costs won't be as difficult. But it's just basic math. You have to buy the property and you have to fix it up. So you have to have the resources to do that. So that alone makes affordability a challenge. And we use very complicated financing tools like the low-income housing tax credit program, historic tax credits. We use HUD dollars that are administered by the city. We use HUD dollars and housing trust fund dollars from the state of Ohio. So we can subsidize the development side. It's very complicated, way too complicated, and frustrating and challenging, all that layered financing. So that's how we can put it together on the development side. You have to be pretty sophisticated to use all of those tools. So it's not available to everybody just out on the street who hasn't gone through lots of training to understand how those tools work. So when I think about 4-unit buildings or 6-unit buildings, or somebody who's got a 20-unit development in the private for-profit sector who just wants to provide affordable housing, they probably wouldn't use those tools, but they would use the traditional financing tools of a bank loan and then their own equity. So then on the operating side, that's where the challenge is even greater. I mean, if you can put together a deal and finance it, you have to make sure you can pay for operations. No bank is going to put their money in a project. I can't go to a bank and get a loan if I can't demonstrate to them how I'm going to pay that loan off over the term of the loan, 15 years. Using low-income housing tax credits, nobody's going to invest in the project if I can't show them an operating pro forma that works. So like the for-profit sector, public or private, there are certain expenses we have to pay. We have to pay for utilities for the common areas, for when we're turning our park, we have to pay for water. We have to pay insurance. We have to pay for maintenance and repairs. We have to pay real estate taxes. Even though we're a nonprofit, we still have to pay real estate taxes. And so as we know, in some neighborhoods, especially where we operate in Over-the-Rhine, where the property values have gone up dramatically, it really puts a pressure on the affordable housing in those areas, because not only do we pay real estate taxes, but now we have to pay the VTICA and pay for the streetcar. We have to pay for trash. Several years ago, the city of Cincinnati, for multifamily units, they don't collect the trash there anymore. So we have to pay to have our trash picked up for larger buildings. And then if you have debt, so if you have a loan, you have to make sure you can pay on that loan. And then if I'm in the for-profit sector, I'm doing this maybe because I want to provide housing and I know the value of home, but I also do it because that's my livelihood. So I need to be able to make some profit. So all of that is why the cashier at Kroger can't can't access a unit in the marketplace, because the market can't charge $500 a month or $400 a month and pay all their responsibilities, pay their debt, and then also have money in their pocket. That is the math challenge. When we do deals, our investors want us to estimate $700 per unit per month operating expense, $700. So that means the rent has to be at least $700. So when we do a bigger deal, some of our rents are going to be really deeply affordable, but then some of them are going to be in the $900 range, so that we can demonstrate that we can support all the expenses that we have and pay the bills over time. They also want us to put money aside, and it's the responsible thing to do, to put money aside in an account so that in 10 or 15 years, when we need a new furnace or when the roof goes, we can replace the roof. The for-profit sector has to do the same thing. So not to kind of hit you over the head with it, but hopefully that makes it really clear why we can't reach folks who are on the lower end of the economic ladder, but who are essential workers who are taking care of our family members in a nursing home, but maybe completely stressed out because they're about to be evicted next week, or they don't know how they're going to pay the rent this month, or they've moved 3 times in the last year, or the preschool teacher, all of these really important jobs where they can't reach, the market just can't reach them. So housing costs have gone up and incomes haven't. So we just have this gap. So I think I'll stop there. And then, yeah, Stacey, if you want to share then what it's like for the families and the reality of that math challenge.
Thank you, Mary. I recognize many of your names as having been involved with Interfaith Hospitality Network in some way or form, whether through your congregation or as individuals. And so many of you are going to be really familiar with some of the experiences our families experience. Some of you have seen those firsthand. I've been doing this work for a relatively short amount of time, working with IHN since 2011. And my previous work was with reentry and incarcerated populations in Cleveland. And I'm only going to mention that because I hope I will remember to circle back around that in a second, because these various issues that we grapple with around housing, they are not in a silo separate from other issues that I know all of you are concerned about. That issue of having criminal justice history in your background as a father or as a mother who is homeless and is trying to not only reclaim your life after a period of incarceration, but also take care of your family, is in and of itself an overwhelming factor in terms of accessing housing, having that history, much less the math that Mary is talking about. So I'll come back to that in a second. But again, many of you know Interfaith Hospitality Network. You know that our core service for the 30 years that we've been operating has been emergency shelter that we do really differently in partnership with faith communities, with all of you, sharing that responsibility for sheltering people who literally have nowhere else to go, with mosques and temples and churches and faith communities of all stripes, sharing that overnight and that daytime shelter responsibility. The other part of what Interfaith does and has always done, but maybe not so in such an organized fashion, is making sure that there is a place for people to go after that period of being sheltered. We want to welcome people in when they have no place to go and provide that hospitality that our faith partners provide. But that in and of itself isn't a solution to the reality that they don't have a safe place to go. And so we want to work on making sure we can find solutions for people, housing that they're going to be able to not only sustain, but thrive in and be able to continue to achieve all the goals that they have as families around career and employment and raising children and accessing education and moving forward. We've done that kind of work in sort of a all of the above fashion, like whatever options there are available in the community, we want to try to access them, and based on the specific circumstances of a family, match them to those opportunities. So a lot of the housing programs that we currently operate are through the HUD Continuum of Care side of funding, where we provide rental subsidy directly attached to case management services using the private market. Accessing landlords all around town we help pay people's rent and then help provide services to make sure they're getting to a point where they can take that rent over at some point, whether that's in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, or for some of our permanent supportive housing, 6 years, longer until they become able to take that over. We also make referrals to traditional rental subsidy vouchers through the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And we are in a better position than we've been in a long time with making referrals there, because there are now some set-asides for people, for families who have struggled with homelessness, and a streamlined referral process that we can get people to access those. And then, of course, many of the families that we come into contact with, because all of those kinds of subsidies, whatever they are limited. Not everyone gets one. Not everyone gets one, whether you're talking about a short-term subsidy or a long-term subsidy. Most people do have to figure out we have to help them figure out how to go back into housing that they will support on their own income, whether that's employment income, or for some folks who are getting benefits like Social Security, SSI, or disability, figuring out a budget that's going to work for them in the housing market with what they have. We use all of those tools to get people into housing. And about 5 years ago, on average, it took us about 27 or 28 days of a shelter stay to get people to an outcome of some kind. Not necessarily a great outcome, but an outcome other than shelter. So about on average, some longer, some shorter, 27 days to move a family through our shelter system and into a housing location. Now, the lucky ones might have had access to a longer term subsidy and more support and more time, but oftentimes even those successful outcomes meant putting people in housing. And you already saw all the numbers that Mary presented. It meant working with what they had and what was available. And so it meant we weren't actually putting people into affordable housing, because we were putting them into housing that was taking, instead of 30% of their income, was taking 60, 70, sometimes 80% of their income just for those rent and utilities. That's not a sustainable situation, right? So that's why we see some of those families multiple times. They make it work for a period of time, but then as soon as something unexpected comes up, or there's a job loss or a change in hours or a change in childcare, or a car repair, as soon as something goes wrong, there's no space in those kinds of budgets to absorb something unexpected. So I share this to say that the reality is, even people that we were successfully housing, what that meant was successful housing was being housed oftentimes in those situations that meant they were housed, but certainly had not ceased to be housing insecure, because there was always going to be that threat hanging over their heads. And again, we didn't do that because we thought that was a great idea, and we're still doing that. We do that because that's the reality of what's available and what people have to work with. So that's 5 or 6 years ago. It took about 27 days to find some kind of outcome, some better than others, many in that precarious situation. Today, it takes about 56 days for people to go through the shelter process and get to some kind of outcome. Again, some better, some with a subsidy maybe that's going to be a little more supportive, and then many still in that situation where the math is against them as soon as they get their apartment keys. And the reason it's taking longer is because even those not great options are becoming less available to us. You all have seen the numbers from LISC about units available to people of very low income. And you just saw what Mary showed you about salaries. And many of the families we work with are working, and many of them aren't even making close to what that chart showed. They're making more like $10 an hour or under. And so at $10 an hour, the kind of rent that HUD says is affordable in that 600, 650 range, that's already 50% of your income just in rent. And that's not counting taxes removed from your paycheck, right? So the options haven't improved, and the time it takes to access those options have lengthened for us. We haven't changed anything about the way we do things. There are just less and less places to put people. And when you compound, coming back to background, you add the fact that we're dealing with very low income, there aren't rents that match those income amounts that are affordable or are sustainable in terms of a family budget. And then because people have been caught in these cycles, they have terrible rental histories and credit. They have been evicted. They have ran out of ways to make it work and have moved multiple times. And so on top of the affordability factor, the units that are available are looking at those backgrounds. And then if you add on top of that, again, anything like criminal justice history or disability, then you're talking about layers of barrier that start to become insurmountable. And I'm going to say that, insurmountable in some cases in terms of finding a really, finding an option that's at all good for someone. The problem with going from 27 days on average to house someone through our shelter program to like 56 is that means we're also serving a smaller number of families in emergency shelter every year. So this lack of options is also causing a bottleneck for us, at least at Interfaith Hospitality Network, that we also are helping less people on that front end who don't have any place else to go, which means those folks are getting stuck in situations where they're staying with others that aren't safe or aren't healthy for them and their children, continuing that couch surfing, or even ending up in situations, and we have many families that are coming from abandoned buildings or periods in their cars, and in having to stay in places like that. So this lack of affordable housing options doesn't just mean that people aren't getting into the kind of housing they need to live and to survive and thrive. It also means that it's impacting our ability in terms of just safety net services, because we have people stuck in that crisis place, unable to move out of it. This all sounds overwhelmingly depressing. There are, of course, still situations where we see people work really hard and find a place and are successful. But you have to, when you see those kinds of situations, when you see a single mom with a couple kids who is a CNA and is working her butt off and taking extra shifts when she can to maintain that apartment, and she has her kids in childcare and she's utilizing all the services she can find to make those things work, you have to understand that the amount of focus and hard work and luck that it takes to make that continue to work, not have something unexpected happen, is really challenging. And so what that means is when you see people who aren't able to do that, it's typically not because they're not trying. It's because it does take that combination of just extraordinary focus as well as luck to make those housing situations to continue to work. And of course, in those best possible situations where people do access a long-term subsidy, like a housing choice voucher, again, this issue of what's available and what's not available is a problem. We just had a family, and in this case, it was a family without children, who had been in our emergency shelter since October, who had a voucher. It was actually a Kentucky voucher, and he could not use the voucher. He extended his time a couple of times looking for housing, he and his partner, and they still never found the available housing to use their voucher. They ended up housed here in Cincinnati. They were able to qualify for a site-based subsidized unit, but they live off of this gentleman's Social Security check, and he'll be paying 30%, which is considered affordable. But in this case, so he'll be paying a couple $100s of a $700 and something check. So again, even though he's accessing housing and he's going to have this long-term subsidy, you can see that he and his partner still will have very limited income to make the rest of their budget work in terms of the needs they may face. I think I'll stop there.
Well, you and Mary have presented some really good information in terms of both the types of jobs that are struggling, and just the difficulties of having affordable housing units. Let's open that up to the public. I'm going to call on Elizabeth Brown first, because she was one of the architects of this forum. So I'm sure Elizabeth wants to weigh in. Elizabeth has been very involved with Interfaith Hospitality Housing at Christ Church Cathedral, as well as AHA.
Bill, I'm going to be difficult and not weigh in. I apologize. I had an emergency and had to leave the room. So I missed most of the presentations. I think this is such an important topic. And I'll just say that one of the reasons I really wanted to see it in these terms is that I've heard several presentations with the numbers, and it doesn't come across to me as much as the memories I have of talking to families, and the fear and the frustration that they have with housing. And I just wanted to be sure that folks understood that. But I'm sure that Mary and Stacey did a great job on it.
Well, I certainly did. Other people wish to talk about this in terms of the personal impacts.
Bill, can I say something? This is Bonnie.
Sure, Bonnie.
It's just how to get these stories out more, encounter some of the politicians' inaccuracy. I mean, just this week, our mayor said that we have more affordable housing now than we did in 2001. And I don't know how many times we can say that that's not true. And so, it's just so frustrating. But yeah, I mean, I just think more and more people need to hear these stories, and you can just feel the pain that the families are going through. I mean, none of us could stay focused the whole time. And I mean, the whole idea that it takes luck, you know what I mean? It's just so sad. But our politicians are nowhere near where we need to be, with them slamming the local housing trust fund ballot initiative and the recent Landsman's balanced development thing isn't really doing anything around inclusionary housing. We got a really deep problem because our politicians are not figuring out a way to do affordable housing. We just need more of it.
I want to just share a response to that. I don't have a recommendation of a necessarily successful way to turn people's minds around, but I encounter people just in my personal life who there's a building next to me that has like 4 empty apartments. I don't understand what the problem is. And I find that there is this, honestly, members of my own family don't believe that people make that little. My dad, and I think I heard a politician say this recently, I mean, he can remember in the 70s, he worked 2 jobs and he was able to pay for X, Y, and Z. And that was true. He did that. But, wages have not kept up with inflation or with the cost of housing or other goods. And so that example for him it just isn't relevant to the current environment. And for people who don't have people in their lives that are making less than $10 an hour, for people living in the suburbs who are more comfortably middle or upper class, it's hard for them to wrap their heads around the idea that people make that little. And sometimes they outright don't believe me that that's possible. Mm-hmm. And if they're making that little at Burger King, well, why aren't they working to get a better job? And on the flip side of a housing affordability is, what are the realities of the actual jobs and wages available to people relative to their education and training? There aren't those, if you just work a little harder, there aren't necessarily those opportunities lined up waiting. And jobs like Amazon that many of our people in shelter are excited to get, because it appears so great on the front end. It's a little bit higher wage, and maybe there's some assistance with transportation and things. The challenges that start to add up for those kinds of jobs is they're typically very far away from where our families are able to find to live. And even with a van that goes from downtown to the site, when you're managing children and you're managing children who have school schedules and other needs, it becomes impossible to make those kinds of situations work. Nevertheless, the conditions and the work realities of those kinds of places, not even considering that. So I'm sorry, I think that was a little bit of a rant on my part, but part of the challenge is to help people understand that even if you're not seeing it, this is in fact occurring. This is real. There are people who make as little as $8-10 an hour for a position. And this is how much that those apartments that you don't see getting filled, they're not getting filled because that 2-bedroom costs $900. And people working the kinds of positions that we're seeing can't afford that.
Yeah, one of the groups that Mary brought up were home healthcare workers who were calling during the pandemic heroines and heroes. And yet they're some of the people that can't afford housing. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah. I wanted to share a story, but I think Janice has her hand up, and so does Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to say something going back to what Bonnie said about some of the untruths that are being stated by the opposition. Just an hour or so ago, when my mail arrived, I received a very slick flyer about voting no on issue 3, the reckless issue 3. And it states that what will happen if issue 3 passes, that 3 fire companies will be cut, 12 to 15 pools will be closed, we'll only have trash collection twice a week, and recycling will be completely eliminated, and on and on and on it goes. And it's put out by some group called Keep Cincinnati Safe, which I can't even find what Keep Cincinnati Safe is. I can't Google it to find out where it is. But this is horrible. And people are going to get this, I guess. I live in Hyde Park, so I'm assuming all over Hyde Park. And I've had a lot of people say they're very concerned about issue 3 because there's been so much vocal opposition, and the Inquirer doesn't seem to be very much in favor of it. So they're publishing all kinds of things like it's a plot to defund the police. So I wonder if anybody knows anything about these, who this is, and how the groups that are supporting issue 3 can counter this, because this is obviously very well funded.
You received that today?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they say in terms of the no on 3 that they've been asked who's funding it, and they won't know until like towards the end of April when those financing reports are due. So we won't know because they're not going to say, but it is very well funded, and it's absolutely a choice. The city council, if the amendment passes, it's really a choice. If they choose to cut those services, then it's on them. They don't have to, especially with the $290 million coming to Cincinnati from the relief funds. Yeah, so it's a choice, and it's a scare tactic for sure. It's very scary when they say those kinds of things.
Mary, you had a story you wanted to
Well, yeah, I'll try to make it quick, but it aligns with what Stacey was saying about people just not believing it. So I think it was last year, this came from the mayor's office. It was a letter that they had received from a woman who works at a Catholic church, and they have a St. Vincent de Paul group that goes out and tries to help people with emergency assistance. So she met with a woman who lived in Avondale, and they did not have plumbing in their apartment. So that would seem unheard of, but I know today there's people living without plumbing. There's people living without utilities. And what she shared with the St. Vincent de Paul worker is that there was a construction site across the street, and they used the porta potty. That's where they went to the bathroom. That's where she and her kids used the bathroom. And so when that response comes in, I think when that kind of need comes in, people are like, well, we pay for shelters. We provide the federal dollars for affordable housing, why isn't there anything available? And then hopefully they'll stay in the conversation and say, well, yeah, Stacey and all the shelters are doing amazing work. Affordable housing is being developed. So they'll have CMHA come in. That's what this Affordable Housing Committee of City Council did a couple of weeks ago to say, look what we're doing. So CMHA will go in and say, talk about the projects they have in the queue, or they might have us come in, they didn't. And we can say the projects that we have in the queue. And they're like, look what we're doing. It's not that people aren't working really hard. It's not enough. It doesn't even come close to addressing the need. And I know if you talk to, Kevin Finn at Strategies, they can talk about the hotline, people call in the CAP line looking for shelter, and Stacey could tell what the percentage is, but all the folks that get turned away. So it's not that good work isn't happening. We just don't have enough resources to address the problem. It's really about needing the resources. And that's, why the $50 million a year is so important. It could be transformational. It could change everything. And some of it has to be ongoing. So that's why I appreciate the $50 million a year. Because it's not a one-time investment, it's ongoing. And there's the opportunity there to invest in all different kinds of affordable housing. And while I have the microphone for a minute, I just, there's so many options that we could choose to pursue as a city. There's hundreds of units going up all across our city. Market rate units or luxury units. It's a really hot market right now, and there's not any affordability in it. So we were engaged in this Elm and Liberty fight to try to get some affordability in there. They were getting a 30-year tax abatement. They don't have to pay into the VTICA for 9 years, which we do have to pay into. Affordable housing pays for the streetcar. But there's no affordability. We shouldn't allow that. And for like Steve Gooden, who's on council now, he was appointed, not elected. And 2 weeks ago, he talked about, it was like this deja vu nightmare, talked about limiting affordable housing in some neighborhoods, including Over-the-Rhine and West End and Price Hill. And we challenged him on it, and his response doesn't address the problem. And we know what happens when you have those kind of conversations about limiting affordable housing in certain neighborhoods. The door doesn't open anywhere else. So you just kind of get stuck with nothing or battles. But I forget what my point was going to be there, but they don't understand the challenges, and they're not, especially someone like that who's new to it, because of common sense, well, we can figure this out without much government intervention. But it's just not true. We need the money. We need some mandates that if you're going to get some tax benefits, you're going to provide some affordability. And how we could open doors to Oakley and other places that have these huge developments. What Stacey alluded to with when you have a Section 8 voucher, it's a cap on what the rents they will pay. And across the state of Ohio, probably across the country, that totally limits where you can look. So we need to increase the amount of money that the voucher program will pay. And people can't find decent units even when they have a voucher. So they're addressing that math problem on the operating side, but it's still not working because we have to lift the cap on it. We have to be able to pay maybe $900 for a 1-bedroom or $1,000 for a 2-bedroom. Otherwise, we're just totally kidding ourselves and pretending like we're doing something while people are being traumatized every day. All right, thank you.
Other responses or questions? While waiting,
Peter, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Mary and Stacey, for the work you guys do. It goes unnoticed, but it's so meaningfully important, I know, in the neighborhoods. But I am from the AFL-CIO, and we are taking a position against issue 3. But what I want to talk about more is the LISC report, which got released last May in the midst of COVID, and it was such a great, inclusive report talking about the problem of affordable housing. It's not a city problem; it's a regional problem. It wasn't created overnight, and it needs a collaborative approach. Because I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever heard Steve Shabbat or Winstrip say affordable housing. Our Republican-dominated legislature has a rainy day fund, but I don't ever hear them talk about affordable housing. And when the report talks about strategic actions and recommendations, from the federal, from the state, from the local, from the private sector, it's so inclusive. What are your thoughts on that, and how can we put more pressure, not just on the city, and And I see this as not just years of failed discriminatory policies, right? I mean, this is failed leadership, not just at the city local, but also at the state and the federal. How can we put more pressure, especially regarding metropolitan housing authorities? How can we, you know, and this is both administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, I think you noted, how can we bring this issue up on a bigger scale with the state and the federal? Because there are housing trusts all across the country and they're doing great things, but we do need more resources. We need dedicated funding streams. How can we make sure that they understand the severity of the problem better at the state and federal level?
Responses to that big question.
Well, with the new administration, I think people are feeling, at least the advocates for housing are feeling more positive. The infrastructure bill is going to have some money in there for housing as well. The relief money, the National Housing Trust Fund, there's going to be increased sources for that. There's some national campaigns that we can all engage in. The National Coalition for the Homeless is working on. One's called Housed, and I can't remember it. What was that, Bonnie?
It's called Housed Campaign.
Yeah. So I think there's some hope, more hope than we've had for a while, that the federal government will step up. And I don't know if Elizabeth can respond to this, but as far as a regional approach, and the county level, I know that that's been challenging over the years because there's so many different jurisdictions. And they tried to tie affordable housing to getting some of the federal dollars into their neighborhood. So if you got some community development block grant funds, there was some commitment that the communities have to make. So some communities opted out of the CDBG fund so they wouldn't have to commit to affordability. I don't know if Elizabeth wants to say anything on that.
Yeah, I think that was back in the day, Mary. I think today, actually, the county government, the county elected officials, and the county administration is more positive toward affordable housing, not just than they used to be, but than the city is, frankly. You know, when they've had money, but their amount of dollars are less, and they have the complication of all the jurisdictions. But there is a great desire right now at the county level to put the monies that they are getting into a housing and to understand what that crisis is. So I think that's a very positive thing locally as far as the region goes. And I also, in responding to Peter, the problem is so huge. It's been gathered over a long period of time, and it'll take everybody to make a response. The city can't wait for the state or the federal government to do something. We need the public funding, and the city has to step up, but also private institutions need to step up. I mean, we have a huge service level that Stacey and Mary represent, but, you know, well-endowed institutions like the cathedral, like the hospitals that have huge endowments, other faith-based groups. I mean, we're in the process now of talking about how we can start a fund that would help the folks who want to develop affordable housing and to make it more possible for them to do that. But it has to be all of these different groups because the problem is just too huge. And it's too easy for someone to say, oh, there's a program out there, you know, that's going to solve it. There's no one program or one group or one, you know, pot of funding that is going to solve the problem. It has to be all of us.
And I just want to
living wage for all workers. And I just think that sometimes that's just not pushed as hard.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add to that, and it sounds simplistic, but part of, I think, what's so special about the way that we do shelter when COVID's not happening with our congregational partners is that people of all different walks of life get to hear these stories and they get to share the stories, because there really is this big pocket of people that has no idea or doesn't believe it. And the more that we can not just have statistics, but also be able to hit people at that heart level with that frontline experience. Well, this is what I heard, and this is what I saw, and this is what the reality is. So I'm hoping someday soon we get to come back together with our congregations and resume that work.
Looks like Justin has had his hand up for a while.
Justin, and then Prince Brown.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I think the question that nobody seems to ask, at least, well, nobody that's opposing issue 3 asks, is what the cost will be if we don't fund affordable housing. This city, if you walk around in where $1 billion has been spent by the city to gentrify and displace people, is like a powder keg. We don't know what's going to happen with this George Floyd case, but we know that it's the 20th anniversary of Timothy Thomas coming up, and there's tension. And you can put we can't put a cop on every corner because we can't afford it. It's a budget buster. But even if you could, there's tension throughout the city. And it's because we have not addressed the racial and inequities that this city has historically been a part of. And the people that are fear-mongering and pitting working class people against working class people, I think it's really a disservice to our community. And we have to get serious about the cost of not taking action, because that's going to be a much bigger bill than anybody can imagine. So that's what we're looking at. The city is a powder keg and it's going to explode. And this is really, I want to thank everybody that has been working for decades to address these issues. And I want to put everybody that's against us on notice. We're coming. This is a moral obligation that the city has, and we're coming to get the check, to put people in housing, to give people dignity, to give people respect. And if you're against us, we ask you to be with us and rethink what you're thinking about.
You know, besides, I'm not an economist, and so I don't speak about this from a position of authority, but besides that obvious moral obligation that we have to make sure people in our community are housed and that there's equal access to safe, affordable housing that supports families. I also think there's an economic argument to make about actual cost of not investing in these things. To the point of trying to bring the private sector in, there are benefits, I would think. Maybe they're a little longer term than, the quarterly profit statement, but having workforces that are housed and healthy and able to come to work and not have interruptions, and increasing the tax base, by having people housed and working, making investments in the infrastructure to support that reality for people. Again, I'm not an economist, but I sometimes try to make that argument. It's a long-term investment, even just from the concrete economic standpoint. Some people can hear that, other people can't.
If I may, I told myself I was going to just sit here and listen today, but whenever I listen to this kind of talk, I find myself becoming increasingly involved emotionally. And so several of you already spoken to this, that this is just a tremendously complex problem. And I think we've got to understand that for so many people, this is not a question of morality. It's a question of power, okay? It's a question of power. And our elected officials, we give them our power. And once we give them our power, we have no way of holding them accountable. So I appreciate what Justin just had to say, because more and more I'm internalizing that view. So I'm wondering, for the people who proposed the fund, the $50 million fund, how you are thinking about following that up with some sort of action around the time or before the time that people will actually be going to the polls. Because I'm sitting here thinking that I would love to see a couple of just really marches in Cincinnati of poor people. I'm wondering what it would look like to the city and to the state and to the country to just see a march of all of the people who are undervalued and unappreciated, even though, as we have said, they are essential workers, cashiers, poorly paid people in the medical profession, bus drivers, what it would look like to see these people marching on the streets of Cincinnati prior to this upcoming vote. So that's one thought I had. And then the other thought is, again, we've got to understand that politicians are not on our side. Politicians respond to money. And they're going to respond to the people who call them into a back room 2:30 in the morning after an election and try to tell them what the realities are out of which they should work and out of which they should do things. So again, I had 50 years ago. So I'm just wondering again, how do people who push to get this $50 million idea to the point where it is plan to follow this up in terms of putting more pressure on people? Because I think ultimately this is what we're up against. It's a power struggle, as Joe Biden, with all of his good intentions in Washington, figuring out. And I know I'm into a little bit of a rant here, but I am frankly just tired of Joe Manchin. And I don't mind saying it. I'm just tired of him. And I'm hoping that when the Democratic Party sends out these solicitation funds for Democratic senatorial candidates, I'm going to say, you have to tell me that no penny that I might send in go to Joe Manchin, because this is a problem where the people to whom we confer our power through the vote are not on our side. They side with the establishment. Thank you for listening to me. I'll mute myself and for whatever that's worth.
Thank you, Prince. And I think your idea of the march, when was that last big march to City Hall? That was about a year and a half ago. It was pretty impressive. I ended up there at City Hall myself, and it was about 300 or 400 people, it seems to me, involved in that. So,
yeah, but I'm not talking about 400. I'm talking about maybe 4,000 or 5,000. I'm talking about. I remember a couple of occasions where we have organized people to sign petitions and go to City Hall about this. I'm talking about a permit march down the center street in Cincinnati of all of these so-called, of all of the essential workers that are underpaid, and see if we could get it on national TV.
Yeah, Mary?
I attend the Cincinnati Action for Housing Now meetings, and so I just put the link up in the chat. And we're all working full-time jobs, and we're trying to also get this campaign going. We're not funded like the Vote No campaign is. So we've got some strategies given our financial and time limits. We're trying to collect stories of folks who have benefited from affordable housing or who were harmed because they didn't have it. So we're in the midst, and we're talking to reporters. We collected over 9,000 signatures. So yeah, a march would be great. We just don't have the folks who have the time to organize those things.
People can volunteer and pass out flyers on your block. Janice, that flyer you got, you can be calling people in Hyde Park and saying, I'm voting for issue 3, and maybe they'll vote for it. So, and they're asking people to use a certain app that you can call your friends and see if, we're trying to get the number that we need so we can get it passed. So if anybody on this call, you can volunteer by going to that website that Mary put on there, because right now we need the votes on May 4th, and if we don't get it, I'm sure there's going to be people trying something else, because we're not going to give up, because we know that we need it.
I just want to mention that when we were passing around petitions, we shared those petitions with the folks we have staying in shelter as well. And that same gentleman I mentioned that took him months to find housing and couldn't use his Kentucky voucher because there wasn't a place willing to accept, the rent that was available. When he signed the petition, he smiled this big smile and he said, will you follow up and tell me where I can apply when this passes? Like he wanted to see like the direct correlation between signing that petition and this effort and what he was going to be able to do for his future with he and his partner. I only share that to say, again, I think that human level, as much as possible, that we can get out there. And I saw Betsy had recommended a story. We would, of course, be happy to connect families to opportunities to tell their stories. But I know I'll be talking on my block. I live in Pleasant Ridge, and we have a whole big mix of folks who feel all different ways about this on all different sides of the spectrum. And so I'll be talking on my block about this with my neighbors.
This has been a very valuable conversation and presentation by both Mary and Stacey. Mary and Stacey, do you have any final comments as we reach the end of this one? Any final insights for us? We're going to continue this in 2 weeks with a focus in 2 weeks on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund initiative itself. So come back for that and let's continue this conversation. I think those of us who have been involved for years on this affordable housing crisis think it is time that something happens at the local level. For so long, we did make it a federal government issue that it's the feds that have let us down. They've cut funds over the years, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's all well and good, but we need all the sources available. And even this trust fund, should it pass, or the amendment, should it pass, the 50 million is not a panacea. It's not going to solve the whole issue. So Peter McClendon's right. It's going to take a collaborative effort from churches and all sorts of groups, the corporate world as well. But anyway, that's my rant for the moment, but I invite you all to come back in 2 weeks to continue this conversation. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, Mary and Stacey, for both your work in the field, but just what you had to say today.
Thank you, everyone. It's really encouraging to see all of you here working on this together.
Well,
Great.